Friends, thank you for being here today. I want to ask you something. What if I told you that one of the most recognizable names on the face of your local shopping mall, a brand you have walked past hundreds of times, a brand your parents bought from, a brand that you assumed would simply always be there, just filed for bankruptcy protection, and almost nobody is talking about what it actually means? Because on February 9th, 2026, Eddie Bauer's Canadian operator did exactly that. They walked into court and filed under the company's Creditors Arrangement Act. And the plan? To shutter up to 180 stores. 180 stores. Now, I know what you are thinking. Companies go bankrupt all the time. This is not that remarkable. And if that is your reaction, I want you to hold that thought. I want you to keep it right there in your mind, because by the time we are done today, you will understand that what you just witnessed is not a corporate misfortune story. It is not a tale about one brand that failed to adapt. What you are looking at is the first visible fracture in a fault line that runs directly beneath the financial foundation of every suburban mall, every commercial landlord, and every household in this country that still believes the way things were is the way things will remain. This is a structural break, and it has already begun. Let me give you a number. Canada carries one of the highest retail square footage per capita ratios in the entire G7. We built more enclosed shopping malls per person than almost any other developed nation on earth. We built this entire architecture, this vast climate-controlled empire of lifestyle consumption, on a single assumption that the middle-class Canadian household would keep spending, that they would keep buying the mid-tier jacket, the lifestyle boot, the branded fleece that says quietly but unmistakably, "I am doing fine." That assumption is now evaporating. Because here is what the Eddie Bauer filing actually tells us, if we are willing to read it honestly. It is not a story about one company, it is a diagnostic. It is the economy telling us in plain language what is happening to Canadian households right now. And what is happening is this: the inflation-battered, debt-saturated, rate-crushed Canadian middle class has stopped living and started surviving. They are not shopping at Eddie Bauer anymore. They are shopping at Dollarama. And that trade down is not a trend. It is a seismic shift. It is the consumer behavior of a population that has quietly, without anyone making a formal announcement, entered a different economic era altogether. This is not a market correction. This is not a downturn. This is an edifice beginning to crumble from within. And the crack you are looking at right now, 180 stores, one brand, one court filing, that is not the damage. That is the warning. The damage is what comes next. And we will get to that. But first, I need to take you back, because to understand why this is happening now, you need to understand why this was always going to happen. Because this crisis was not created last month. It was not created last year. It was built brick by brick, store by store, mall by mall, over the better part of 3 decades. The story begins with a simple, almost innocent idea: give people access to things they cannot truly afford, and they will spend. Stretch the credit, lower the rate, build the infrastructure of aspiration, and for a very long time, it worked. In the 1990s and into the 2000s, the Canadian consumer was handed the greatest gift the financial system knows how to give: cheap money. Interest rates fell, mortgages became manageable, credit cards became ubiquitous, and the mall, that cathedral of the middle class, became the temple where the dream was purchased, one transaction at a time. Developers understood this. They built more. They anchored those malls around lifestyle brands: Eddie Bauer, Roots, Reitman's, names that carried a specific cultural weight. These were not luxury brands. They were the brands of the aspirational middle, the brands that said, "You have made it, not all the way, but you are on your way." And those brands required foot traffic, and foot traffic required anchor tenants. And anchor tenants required the one thing this entire architecture was built upon: a consumer with money left over at the end of the month. Think of it like a mechanism, a gear system. When the consumer spends, the retailer earns. When the retailer earns, it pays rent. When rent is paid, the mall's landlord services its debt. When the landlord services its debt, the bank is happy. When the bank is happy, it lends more. And the whole system turns elegantly, quietly, almost invisibly. But here is what the architects of this system understood and what they never told you. The gear that drives everything, the consumer, was by the turn of the millennium increasingly running not on income but on debt. The spending was real. The consumption was real. The coffee cups, the parkas, the running shoes, all real. But the purchasing power behind them, it was borrowed. And borrowed purchasing power is not wealth. It is a claim on future wealth. It is a promise that tomorrow will be prosperous enough to repay what today consumed. And that promise, friends, is now coming due. Here is a fact that I want you to sit with. Canadian households carry among the highest debt-to-income ratios in the entire OECD, the club of the world's wealthiest nations. That means that for every dollar of income a Canadian household earns, they owe more in debt than almost any other developed nation on earth. And when interest rates rose, when the Bank of Canada, following the global tightening cycle, began pushing borrowing costs to levels this generation of consumers had never actually experienced in their adult lives, what happened to that debt? It did not disappear. It got heavier. Every month, the mortgage renewal came in higher. Every month, the credit card statement was less manageable. Every month, the line item for discretionary spending, the jacket, the boots, the lifestyle brand purchase, shrank. This is what I call the squeeze architecture. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is quiet, grinding, and cumulative. One household stops buying a jacket, then another. Then the sales figures at Eddie Bauer Canada come in soft. Then they come in softer. Then the board makes a decision. Then the lawyers draft the filing. Then 180 stores close. And here is the crucial secret of this entire system that I want to return to, the part that will make everything else we discuss today snap into focus. Because the Eddie Bauer story is not ultimately about retail. It is about what happens to commercial real estate when retail collapses, and what happens to the banks that lent against that real estate, and what happens to the pension funds that bought the REITs that owned those malls. The decay moves upstream quietly and systematically from the storefront to the balance sheet of every financial institution that believed the architecture was permanent. We will explore that in full. But first, let us look at what is happening right now on the ground, because the evidence is already there for anyone willing to look. Let me show you what is happening right now, not in theory, not in projection. Right now, on the ground, in the malls, in the leasing offices, in the balance sheets of the landlords who are quietly beginning to understand what they are sitting on. When an anchor tenant leaves a mall, and let me be precise about what anchor tenant means in this context, because it matters enormously. It does not simply leave a dark storefront. It triggers a mechanical chain reaction that is written directly into the lease contracts of every smaller tenant in that building. It is called a co-tenancy clause. And what it says in plain language is this: if the anchor tenant that drew me to this location closes, my obligation to pay full rent is reduced or eliminated. Think about what that means. The mall's landlord loses the anchor. Then, by legal contract, it begins losing rent from the boutique on the left and the shoe store on the right and the coffee kiosk by the atrium. The vacancy contagion does not wait. It does not ask permission. It is already embedded in the architecture of the building itself. This is already beginning to unfold across the greater Toronto and Hamilton area. The secondary malls, the ones that are not Yorkdale, not Square One, not the Tier 1 flagship properties, They are already fragile. The prime urban malls will survive. They will adapt. They will convert. But the suburban secondary mall, the one anchored by an Eddie Bauer on one end and a Reitman's on the other with a food court that used to be full on a Saturday, that is the structure that is now cracking at the foundation. And when that structure cracks, it does not crack quietly. Because here is the canary that tells us the rot has already spread beyond what the headlines are reporting. It is not just Eddie Bauer. I want you to understand the full landscape of what has been happening in Canadian mid-tier retail in the months leading up to this filing, because when you see it all together, the picture shifts from unfortunate bankruptcy to something far more disturbing. Inflation-strapped consumers pivoting to Dollarama-style survivalism is not a metaphor. It is a measurable, documented behavior shift. Dollarama, Canada's largest dollar store chain, has demonstrated extraordinary resilience precisely because what it sells is not aspiration. It sells necessity. And when a population begins shopping for necessity instead of aspiration, the brands built on aspiration do not merely slow down. They implode because their entire cost structure, their rent, their staffing, their inventory financing, was calibrated for a world where the Canadian consumer had discretionary income left over, and that world is vanishing in real time. Here is the forensic evidence. Mid-tier apparel brands have been under pressure globally since 2022. That is not a surprise. But what makes the Canadian situation uniquely dangerous is the compounding pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. You have higher interest rates, compressing household cash flow. You have inflation disproportionately affecting middle income earners, the very demographic these brands were built to serve. You have labor costs rising because of minimum wage increases across multiple provinces. You have e-commerce continuing to peel away the casual browser who might have once wandered into an Eddie Bauer simply because it was there. And underneath all of it, you have the structural weight of the highest household debt-to-income ratio in the OECD pressing down on every single discretionary purchase decision. These pressures did not emerge simultaneously by accident. They converged. And the brands caught in the middle, not cheap enough to be Dollarama, not premium enough to be worth sacrificing to have, are being crushed in the gap between what they used to be and what the market no longer has the capacity to support. Now, let me dismantle the hope you might be holding on to, because I know the instinct. When you hear about a retail bankruptcy, the instinct is to look for the escape, to find the asset class, the safe harbor, the corner of the financial map where this particular storm does not reach. And I want to walk through those exits systematically because I believe you deserve honesty about what each of them actually offers right now. Stocks, if you are looking at the Canadian REITs with heavy retail exposure, the real estate investment trusts that own these malls, that collect this rent, that service their debt on the assumption of stable occupancy, you need to understand what happens to a REIT when cap rates expand. When risk premiums rise, when bond yields stay elevated, commercial property valuations fall. Not because the building disappeared, because the math changes. The income stream becomes less certain, and the market reprices it immediately. We saw this play out during the 2020 pandemic shock when retail-heavy REITs saw severe volatility. That was a temporary shock. What is unfolding now is a structural shift. The repricing that follows a structural shift does not recover in 18 months. Bonds, the bond market, what I would call the vigilantes, does not forgive landlords who cannot make their payments. Commercial real estate debt is not a forgiving instrument. Mall properties require high operating costs just to keep the lights on. Security, HVAC systems, maintenance, cleaning, parking infrastructure. When occupancy falls and rent revenue shrinks, those fixed operating costs do not shrink with it. They stay exactly where they are, and the debt service stays exactly where it is. The squeeze is vertical. Income drops, costs hold. The math becomes brutal very quickly. Cash, if you are sitting in Canadian dollars thinking that liquidity is safety, I want you to consider what inflation has already done to your purchasing power. The middle income household in Canada is not poorer because their account balance fell. They are poorer because every dollar in that account buys less. The grocery store, the utility bill, the insurance renewal, every fixed cost of existence has repriced higher, while wages for most of the middle class have not kept pace. This is what I call the money illusion. You look at your savings and you see a number, and the number looks the same as it did 3 years ago, but you are not measuring what it can actually do. You are not measuring what it can actually buy. And the answer quietly is less, measurably, documentably less. And this is precisely where the most dangerous psychological trap lives. Because the human mind, and I am not speaking abstractly here, I am speaking about the specific cognitive architecture that every one of us carries. The human mind is hardwired to believe that tomorrow will look like yesterday. Psychologists call it normalcy bias. It is the reason people stand in a building that is on fire and try to finish their lunch before they leave. It is the reason people look at a mall that is beginning to hollow out and say, they will find new tenants, they always do. It is the reason the retailer's creditors extended one more credit line when the fundamentals already told the honest story. And right now, normalcy bias is the single most expensive cognitive error a Canadian investor or property owner or household can be making. Because here is what is actually happening, laid out with the clarity it deserves. The liquidity tide is going out, and we are about to find out who has been swimming naked. The retailer borrows to finance inventory. When sales slow, inventory sits. When inventory sits, margins compress. When margins compress, the credit line gets called. When the credit line gets called, the filing gets made. When the filing gets made, the mall loses a tenant. When the mall loses a tenant, the co-tenancy clause activates. When co-tenancy activates, rental income falls. When rental income falls, the landlord's debt coverage ratio deteriorates. When that ratio deteriorates, the lender reassesses. And when the lender reassesses a portfolio of secondary malls in a high-rate environment where the retail anchor model is structurally impaired, friends, the number that comes back is not the number anyone wants to see. This is not a scenario. This is a sequence. It is already in motion. The Eddie Bauer filing is not the prediction. It is the evidence that the sequence has already started. And the contagion does not stop at the mall, because Canada has built an enormous amount of its commercial real estate lending, and by extension, a significant component of its financial sector's balance sheet, on the assumption that these properties retain their value. Strip that assumption away, and the question becomes very uncomfortable very quickly. What is the true mark-to-reality value of secondary mall real estate in Canada when the mid-tier anchor model is broken? The answer to that question has not been fully priced into the market yet. That is what I call a default in all but name. The situation where the economic reality has already shifted, but the accounting reality has not caught up, where the balance sheet still shows an asset at acquisition value while the ground beneath it is cracking. And this convergence, the consumer squeeze, the retail implosion, the commercial real estate repricing, and the credit market exposure beneath it all, is precisely what we are now navigating. It is not coming. It is not a risk to be monitored. It is a structural fault line that is actively widening. The window for clarity is not endless. The window for preparation is not endless. And in our final section, I want to talk about what all of this actually means for you, for your decisions, your assets, your positioning, and what the honest path through this period looks like for anyone who is willing to see it clearly. Let me bring this together, because everything we have walked through today, the Eddie Bauer filing, the co-tenancy cascade, the consumer squeeze, the commercial real estate exposure, the credit lines being quietly reassessed in lending offices across this country, none of it exists in isolation. Each piece is connected to the others. And when you see the connections clearly, what emerges is not a series of unfortunate events. What emerges is a convergence, a trifecta of structural pressures hitting simultaneously from three distinct directions, each one compounding the damage of the others. The first force is the consumer foundation collapse. The Canadian middle-class household, the engine that powered 3 decades of mall construction, lifestyle brand expansion, and commercial real estate appreciation, has hit a wall. Not a temporary wall, a structural one. The debt-to-income ratio that Canadian households now carry is not a cyclical problem. It is not something that resolves when rates come down a quarter point. It is the accumulated weight of decades of borrowed consumption, now being serviced in a high-rate environment that this generation of borrowers has never actually experienced as adults. The consumer is not pausing. The consumer is repricing their entire existence downward, from lifestyle to survival, from Eddie Bauer to Dollarama, and that repricing does not reverse overnight. It reverses, if it reverses at all, over years. And in those years, every business model built on the assumption of Canadian middle-class discretionary spending is operating on borrowed time. The second force is the retail and commercial real estate implosion. The architecture of the enclosed suburban mall was always more fragile than it appeared. It required constant occupancy. It required anchor tenants who stayed. It required a consumer who kept coming through the door. Remove any one of those requirements and the model strains. Remove all three simultaneously and the model does not strain. It implodes. 180 Eddie Bauer stores closing does not just affect Eddie Bauer. It affects every small tenant in every one of those malls. It affects every landlord collecting rent from those buildings. It affects every lender who holds commercial real estate debt against those properties. And it affects every pension fund and REIT investor who assumed that Canadian commercial real estate was a stable income-generating asset class. The valuations that made sense in a world of low rates and stable occupancy do not make sense in this world. And the market will eventually price that correctly. It always does. The third force is the credit and lending exposure running beneath the surface. This is the part that almost never makes the headlines until it is too late to matter, because the commercial real estate debt sitting on Canadian bank and lender balance sheets is not marked to the reality that is unfolding right now. It is marked to models, to assumptions, to cap rates calculated in an environment that no longer exists. When secondary malls begin repricing, and they will, because vacancy rates rise, rental income falls, and the math becomes undeniable, the lenders who hold that debt will face a choice. They can extend and pretend, continuing to carry those loans at values that no longer reflect reality, or they can mark them down, take the losses, and tighten the credit standards that flow through to every other borrower in their portfolio. Neither path is comfortable. Both paths have consequences that ripple far beyond the mall parking lot. This is the convergence. Consumer collapse, retail implosion, credit exposure, three forces, one direction, and they are all moving at the same time. Now, I want to stop talking about the system for a moment. I want to talk about you. because understanding a crisis intellectually and navigating it practically are two entirely different things. And the gap between those two things is almost always filled by something that has nothing to do with economics or finance or real estate valuations. It is filled by psychology. Human beings are hardwired to believe that tomorrow will look like yesterday. I told you this earlier, and I want to return to it now with more precision. Normalcy bias is not a character flaw. It is not ignorance. It is a feature of the human mind that evolved for a world where most days genuinely did look like the day before. Stability was the norm. Disruption was the exception. And the mind that could quickly return to the assumption of stability after a disruption was a mind that functioned efficiently. But we are not living in that environment right now. We are living in a period where the structural assumptions that govern the last 30 years of economic life in this country are being revised, not tweaked, revised. And the mind that keeps reaching for yesterday's template, the mind that says the mall will find new tenants, the brand will restructure and come back, real estate always recovers, the consumer always bounces back, that mind is not being optimistic. It is being dangerous because it is using a map that no longer matches the territory. The second psychological trap is what I call the money illusion. And I want to be very direct about this because it is the most seductive trap available to the Canadian household right now. You look at your investment account and you see a number. You look at your savings and you see a number. You look at the assessed value of your home and you see a number. And those numbers feel real. They feel like wealth. But wealth is not a number. Wealth is purchasing power. Wealth is what those numbers can actually do, what they can buy, what they can sustain, what they can protect. And when inflation has eroded your purchasing power by 15 or 20% over 3 years, while your nominal account balance held steady, you have not maintained your wealth. You have lost it quietly, invisibly, in a way that never triggered an alarm because the number on the screen never went down. This is the illusion. You become wealthier on paper and poorer at the grocery store. You become wealthier on paper and poorer at the insurance renewal. You become wealthier on paper and poorer at every point where your financial life intersects with the real economy. And the households most exposed to this illusion are the ones who built their financial identity around the assets that the current environment is now repricing. The suburban home whose commercial neighborhood is hollowing out, the RIT position that assumed stable retail occupancy, the retirement account weighted toward the sectors that are now under the most structural pressure. Seeing through the illusion requires asking a different question. Not what is my number, but what does my number actually do in this environment? Not what did this asset return last decade, but what is the structural basis for its value in the decade that is beginning right now? And when you ask those questions honestly, the answer points in a consistent direction. It points toward the distinction between assets and claims on assets, between things that hold value because of what they physically are and things that hold value because of what someone else promises to deliver, between real and paper, between hard and soft, between the thing itself and the IOU written against it. Do you own assets or do you own claims on assets? This is not a rhetorical question. I want you to answer it specifically about your own portfolio, your own balance sheet, your own financial architecture, because the answer to that question determines how the coming repricing affects you. Stocks are claims on corporate earnings. ETFs are claims on baskets of those claims. Commercial REITs are claims on rental income from buildings whose occupancy is now structurally impaired. Cash is a claim on the purchasing power of a currency that inflation is actively eroding. Every one of these instruments requires something else to perform in order for it to retain its value. Every one of them is downstream of a system that is currently under stress. Gold and silver are not claims on anything. They do not require a counterparty to perform. They do not require a corporation to remain solvent, a tenant to pay rent, a government to manage its inflation responsibly, or a bank to remain liquid. They exist outside the cascade. And in a period where the cascade is active, where the consumer squeezes the retailer, squeezes the landlord, squeezes the lender, squeezes the balance sheet, being outside the cascade is not a luxury. It is a structural position. I want to be precise about what I am. And am not saying here, I am not saying that gold solves the problem of a mall closing. I am not saying that silver reverses the structural shift in Canadian consumer behavior. What I am saying is that when an entire financial architecture is being repriced, when the assumptions that underpinned 30 years of asset valuations are being revised in real time, the assets that hold their value independent of those assumptions are not performing an investment function. They are performing a preservation function. They are stepping out of the line of fire. And right now, the line of fire runs directly through every asset class that depends on the Canadian middle-class consumer continuing to spend at the level they spent before. It runs through the lifestyle brands. It runs through the malls. It runs through the commercial landlords. It runs through the lenders behind them. And it runs through every investment vehicle that assumed those structures were permanent. The question is not whether the repricing is coming. The filing on February 9th told you the repricing has already started. The question is whether you are positioned inside the repricing or outside of it, whether you are holding the claims or holding the assets, whether you have looked honestly at your financial architecture and asked, how much of what I own depends on a world that is no longer the world we are living in? Canada has built an enormous amount of wealth, real wealth, paper wealth, and every gradation in between, on the back of an enclosed mall model, a lifestyle retail model, and a leveraged consumer model that is now structurally impaired. The impairment did not begin with Eddie Bauer's filing, but Eddie Bauer's filing is a moment of clarity. It is the system speaking plainly if you are willing to listen. It is 180 storefronts going dark and saying, in the aggregate, the consumer who sustained this is no longer there. The ghost mall is not a metaphor for the future. It is a description of what is already beginning. The question is how far it spreads, how fast the repricing moves, and how many households, investors, and institutions are positioned to weather it versus how many are still operating on yesterday's map. Friends, I have given you the full picture today as I understand it, not to alarm you for the sake of alarm, not to perform urgency for the sake of engagement, but because the clarity that comes from seeing a structural shift honestly, before the consensus catches up, before the headlines get loud, before the repricing is fully reflected in every asset class, that clarity is the only genuine edge available to the individual investor and the individual household in a moment like this one. The decisions that matter most are made in the windows before the storm is obvious to everyone. And this window right now in February of 2026, with the filings beginning and the malls beginning to hollow and the consumer beginning to reprice their existence downward, this window is open. It will not stay open indefinitely. History favors the prepared, and the window for preparation is closing.